So in this video, we'll continue discussing violence in human nature. Specifically, we'll continue discussing Zinn's argument that there is no good evidence for the claim that violence is part of human nature, and we'll focus on what he says about history. Now, you might think that even if anthropology and ethology and biology and psychology fail to find evidence that violence is part of human nature, surely history provides sufficient evidence. Remember, the claim that violence is part of human nature is being specified as follows. We called the thesis H, and H holds that without government, there is a wide range of circumstances in which people will regularly behave violently towards one another, and a narrow range of circumstances in which even a significant minority won't. Well, surely, the idea goes, history demonstrates that that's true. After all, look at all the violence throughout human history. So here's the idea. History is full of war. If history is full of war, then violence is part of human nature in the sense we just specified. Therefore, violence is part of human nature. Zinn counters as follows. He says that premise 2, the claim that history being full of war implies that violence is part of human nature, is false given any plausible interpretation of the claim that history is full of war. Now here Zinn is going to provide an argument. I'm going to label it 2 sub 1, 2 sub 2, and so on because it's countering premise 2 in the original argument. So here's the first premise. History being full of war implies that violence is part of human nature only if the best explanation for nations entering war or soldiers entering war is that they have an innate drive towards violence, or war is ubiquitous, it's just always occurring. Then he says the decision of nations to enter war is not best explained by citizens' innate drive towards violence, and the decision of soldiers to enter war is not best explained by their innate drive towards violence. War isn't ubiquitous, so history being full of warfare doesn't imply that violence is part of human nature. That is, 2 in the argument from history is false. Now, if you remember your argument forms, this has the form of modus tollens. That means the first premise says if certain conditions hold, specifically if history being full of warfare implies that violence is part of human nature, then certain other conditions hold. The best explanation for natures entering war or soldiers entering war is that they have an innate drive towards violence or war is ubiquitous. The premises then say those other conditions don't hold, so the initial condition, history being full of warfare implying that violence is part of human nature, doesn't hold. Okay, so Zinn is going to go through and consider the premises of this argument. So first, the decision of nations to enter war is not best explained by a citizen's innate drive towards violence. Here's what he says about this one. He says, are there not persistent facts about human society that can explain the constant eruption of war without recourse to those mysterious instincts that science, however hard it tries, cannot find in our genes? Is not one of those facts that drive people to war the existence of ruling elites in every culture who become enamored of their own power and seek to extend it? Is not another of those facts the greed, not of the general population, but of powerful minorities in society who seek more raw materials or markets or more land or more favorable places for investment? Is there not a persistent ideology of nationalism, especially in the modern world, a set of beliefs taught to each generation in which the motherland or fatherland is an object of veneration and becomes a burning cause for which one becomes willing to kill the children of other motherlands or fatherlands? So what he's saying here is there's all sorts of contingent social causes of war, aside from citizens' drive towards violence, that provide a better explanation for why nations enter war. Now let's look at the next premise, the claim that the decisions of soldiers to enter war is not best explained by their innate drive towards violence. And here's what he says. When you look at modern war, do you find men rushing into it with a ferocious desire to kill? Hardly. You find men, and some women, joining the armed forces in search of training, careers, companionship, glamour, and psychological and economic security. You find others being conscripted to be soldiers by law, under penalty of prison if they refuse. And all of them suddenly transported into war, where the habit of following orders and then dinning into their ears of the tightness, that should be the rightness of their cause can overcome the fear of death or the moral scruples of murdering another human being. So the idea here is that it's not that people sign up for war because it gives them an excuse to go kill, any more than people in the Milgram experiment follow the experimenters' orders because the experiment just gives them an excuse to harm others. Instead, people sign up for the military for all sorts of other reasons that have nothing to do with an innate desire to hurt other people, and then they get thrown into war, where they end up having to hurt other people. So that's a kind of a general consideration. Then he offers a personal consideration in support of the same premise. He's talking about his own experience in war. Howard Zinn was a decorated bombardier in World War II. He says, "We had been brought up to believe that our political leaders had good motives and could be trusted to do right in the world. We had learned that the world had good guys and bad guys, good countries and bad countries, and ours was good. We had been trained to fly planes, fire guns, operate bomb sites, and to take pride in doing the job well. And we had been trained to follow orders, which there was no reason to question because everyone on our side was good and on the other side bad. Besides, we didn't have to watch a little girl's legs get blown off by our bombs. We were 30,000 feet high and no human being on the ground was visible. No scream could be heard. Surely, says Zinn, that is enough to explain how men can participate in war. We don't have to grope in the darkness of human nature." And when he says the darkness of human nature here, he doesn't mean that human nature is dark. What he means is that it's unknown, it's muddy, it's murky. We don't really know what human nature is, and or even if there is any interesting sense in which there is human nature. And nonetheless, people look there to explain war, despite the fact that there's easy explanations, more plausible explanations for why soldiers enter war. So next up is the premise that war isn't ubiquitous. Zinn points out that there are nations that don't go to war at all, and even for nations that go to war, many enjoy long periods of peace. So let's return to the original argument. Zinn thinks that history being full of warfare implies that violence is part of human nature only if the reason that nations and soldiers enter war is because of an innate drive towards violence, or war is just all the time everywhere. And then he says the reason that soldiers and nations enter war isn't because of an innate drive towards violence. It isn't best explained by an innate drive towards violence, and that war isn't all the time everywhere. So history being full of warfare doesn't imply that violence is part of human nature. So the argument from history is false. And he's defended these premises. That's what I'm pointing out with the check marks. So when we look back at the argument from history, says Zinn, the first premise is, if interpreted to mean anything reasonable, like there's a lot of war rather than war is all the time everywhere, can come out true, but then the second premise comes out false. Okay, so in this part on Zinn's views on whether violence is part of human nature, we considered some objections that Hobbes considers, so that we made sure, in order to make sure that they don't provide ready responses to what Zinn has to say, and they in fact don't provide ready responses to what Zinn has to say. We then looked at what Zinn has to say, his reasons for thinking that there's no good evidence that violence is part of human nature, where again that's understood to mean that without government there's a wide range of circumstances in which most people will frequently behave violently towards one another, but a narrow range of circumstances in which they won't. And then we can quickly summarize. Hobbes argues that H is true. He then argues that we need government because H is true, and Zinn counters that there's no good evidence for H, although he says nothing about why we need government otherwise, or if we need a government otherwise. So this will conclude our section on violence and human nature. Remember, we started out by talking about what it is for a characteristic to be part of human nature. We did that by talking about what it is for a characteristic to be part of an individual's nature, and then part of a species' nature, and then put those together to figure out what it is for violence to be part of human nature. With that specified, we considered Hobbes' view, which says that violence on that specification is part of human nature, meaning absent government, there's a wide range of circumstances in which people will regularly be violent towards one another, and a narrow range of circumstances in which even a significant minority won't. We then looked at Zinn's view that there's in fact no good evidence for that claim that Hobbes advances. And that will end the section on violence and human nature.